Welcome again. I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program on the heroines of the Holocaust, which we're hosting in celebration of Women's History Month and in honor of the thousands of amazing women who fought back against Nazism, but are not always included in the stories we tell about this chapter of history. In addition to being a part of Women's History Month, this date is symbolic because we're just a few weeks away from the 78th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the single largest act of armed resistance by Jews against the Nazis. Our featured guests today are Lori Weintrob, director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center, who's devoted her recent scholarship to women resistance leaders in the Holocaust, and Rokhl Kafrissen, a terrific Yiddish culture writer and Tablet magazine contributor. And later in the program, we'll be joined by special guest Rachel Roth, a survivor of Auschwitz who witnessed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising firsthand. Rachel is assisted by her son, Ram Roth, and her grandchildren. Please feel free to share questions in the Zoom chat and Q&A box, and we'll address as many as we can at the end of the program. Without further ado, welcome Lori, Rachel, Rachel, and Ram, and feel free to get started.
Thank you, Ari, for your kind introduction. I want to express my gratitude to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for inviting us here to discuss my research on women and resistance. And I want to thank Rokhl Kafrissen for our invaluable exchanges on Yiddish culture and the Holocaust. I also want to welcome this evening any Holocaust survivors and their families, my colleagues, and all of you for taking the time to join us. Women leaders were instrumental in fighting back against anti-Semitism and Nazism. Women were critical to the Jewish underground and resistance networks in many countries as journalists, as medical personnel, as smugglers of Jewish children, as armed fighters and strategists, and couriers of intelligence and false papers. How many women? At least 3,000 Jewish women fought in the ghettos and partisans units, and much more if we include the rescue and resistance networks from France to Greece and Morocco. Over 12,000 non-Jewish women are listed as righteous Gentiles, and over 100,000 Jewish women fought in the Allied military forces, including as combat pilots. One Jewish combat pilot shot down 12 enemy aircraft. Over the past 5 years, what began as a quest to understand Zivia Lubetkin, the highest ranking and only woman in the command of the Warsaw Ghetto, was expanded through reading written and oral testimony of hundreds of women in the resistance. Tonight, I am focusing on Jewish women, but the larger project, Heroines of the Holocaust, engages women of all faiths and races who participated in saving Jewish lives or fighting against Nazism throughout the world. When the Israeli government selected the 27th of Nisan as a national day of commemoration for the Shoah, they chose the title Yom HaShoah v'Hagavura, a day of remembrance of Holocaust martyrs and heroes. April was chosen for its connection to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and other acts of resistance. I argue we must highlight in our commemorations and in Holocaust and human rights education, rescue and resistance, and women's leadership to deepen our understanding of how the Holocaust happened. Why can we name the perpetrators but not the resistors? There are many role models of upstanders, so critical at this moment of global rising anti-Semitism and racism. Women resistors like the partisan Faye Shulman, whose nursing and photography skills were highly valued, cared deeply that the world know that the Jews and Jewish women resisted. She said, "I want people to know there was resistance. I took photographs. I have proof." As one of the leading historians of women in the Holocaust, Judy Baumel-Schwartz has written, "Women, heroism, and Holocaust evoke a broad spectrum of associations, from resistance fighters to self-sacrificing mothers and underground couriers to religious martyrs. Faye Shulman's photos, like Anne Frank's diary or the art of the children of Terezin and their teacher Friedel Dicker Brandeis, also represent a form of resistance and defiance. So too was the poetry of Marianne Cohn, a Jewish refugee from the Nazis who rescued children in France at the age of 20 before being tortured and killed. I am deeply thankful to all the Holocaust survivors who I've worked with over the past 10 years, and also to the supporters of the Wagner College Holocaust Center. The survivors' courage has inspired this work. Hearing Rachel Roth's testimony prior to my first trip to Warsaw and Auschwitz with my Wagner College students was one of the catalysts for this project on heroines of the Holocaust. Her mother, Golda, as we will see, urged Rachel to defy, quote, that scum Hitler. Finally, I must add, women have long been on the front lines of social justice movements, indeed its backbone, yet are often rendered invisible. A recent study by the Pew Research Center suggests that women excel at compromise and negotiation in situations where men might take risks and escalate tension. Zivia Lubetkin and other women offer clear lessons in transformational leadership relevant to the school of the human spirit. I start our presentation this evening with two women who were on the front lines of the final solution. Listen to their courage as they confront the horrors of the Holocaust. When the Nazis invade Russia in Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and specifically Lithuania, Sarah Ganaita's three uncles are murdered by their janitor in a pogrom incited by the Nazis. As the summer ended, Sarah and her family were relocated to the Kovno ghetto, but true horror was her witnessing at age 17 the first Action in October, when Nazis marched 10,000 Jews to be executed at Ninth Fort. Sarah wrote, quote, "What I saw will never fade from my memory. A slow-moving procession of shadows with neither a beginning or end, surrounded by armed policemen, that nightmare vision of 10,000 people marching towards death. She resolved to take her fate into her own hands. Her fluent Lithuanian language skills and light hair earned her a name she did not like, Sarah the Blonde, from the head of the underground in Kovno. Sarah was able to smuggle first food, then weapons into the ghetto. At one point, by telling one of the Jewish policemen that she had something not kosher, and he helped her across. Later, after she escapes with her husband Misha to join the partisan unit Death to the Occupiers, she travels back to the ghetto to help groups escape, including Jewish children. And as a partisan, she stood up for the rights of women to be involved in warfare. Later, she was photographed with a rifle standing guard during the liberation of the Vilna ghetto. This rifle had been a gift from her commander Kosta after a moving speech she gave to the Lithuanian partisans for International Women's Day 1944. And as you know, only last Monday we celebrated International Women's Day. This, many years ago, she said, "Nobody taught us how to fight or to perform our duties. We learned by ourselves not only how to clean and use a gun, but how to conduct ourselves in combat and battle, how to blow up a bridge or a train, how to cut communication lines, and had to stand on guard." And she kissed the rifle. She was so happy to have this precious gift. And this is the famous photo taken by a Jewish Soviet officer when he saw her on the day of liberation. Wittke Kempner was a few years older. She too was 17 when the Nazis invaded her hometown in eastern Poland in 1939. She fled the Nazi invasion to go to Vilna, Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of Europe, which was still held by the Soviets. She used false papers. She later wrote, "This was my first act of resistance." She could not stand to see the way the Germans were treating the Jews already in 1939. In Vilna, she joined Hatzomer Hatzair, the Zionist youth group, which would later become a resistance cell of Ava Kovner. But otherwise, she lived in a convent and taught Catholic children. After the Einsatzgruppe and the Nazi killing units massacred 30,000 Jews at Ponary, the forest 8 miles outside of Vilna, 24-year-old Ava Kovner and other Jewish youths sensed the scale of the danger. They recognized early that the massacre site of Ponary was not an isolated incident, but part of a systemic plan for extermination. Hitler conspires to kill all the Jews of Europe, and the Jews of Lithuania have been picked at the first line, wrote Ava Kovner, in what is now considered the first call for armed Jewish resistance. His words, "Rise up until your last breath," galvanized Zionist youth leaders and their allies in the Communist Party to create the United Partisan Organization, or FPO. Already just a few months after the manifesto, Rushka Korchek, who's pictured on the left, said, "What is different about this night? We are different. If we fall, we shall fall fighting. Our blood will bring redemption." Consider this image. The first act of sabotage by Jewish fighters in Lithuania is credited to Vitka Kempner, a Jewish woman, 20 years old. Smuggling a homemade bomb out of the ghetto after spending many nights searching for the right location to not trigger collective reprisal, she killed 200 German soldiers, she and her team. Kempner was one of the chief lieutenants of the United Partisan Organization, tracking the timetable of German military trains and smuggling weapons in and out of the ghetto. Her contemporaries admired her. One of the most famous Jewish poets of Vilna, Hirsch Glick, well known for the Jewish partisan song Zog nit kein Mol, that ends, "We are here," paid tribute to her bravery in a Yiddish poem, Still die Nacht, Quiet the Night is Full of Stars. Glick wrote of a girl in a short coat and a beret with a face as soft as velvet, who watched for and stopped a truck loaded with ammunition. And in this video clip that we're about to watch, one of my students will dramatize, will sing this ballad in Yiddish and English. And then also we will see Vitka's determination to continue acts of sabotage, including in Vilna itself after she had escaped to the partisans.
Still die Nacht, die Säugen stellt, und der Frost hat stark gebrennt. Siegerst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt. Halt nach Schweier in der Hand. The quiet night is full of stars, and the frost has strongly burned. Do you remember how I have taught you how to hold a revolver in your hand? Before daybreak she called from the woods, with snow garlands in her hair, cheered on by the small dear victory for our new free generation.
I was the commander of the patrol group, and I was going, every day almost, to look for a way of taking action and fighting the Germans. And then I would come back, and by night I would escort the group for acts of sabotage. I can speak of one of my deeds, and I think it is the most important. I was sent to Vilna to make connections and carry out sabotage. Together with Heidka and some of the other boys, we decided to do sabotage in Vilna so that the Germans would be afraid that the partisans had come, even to Vilna. And the aim was to have the girls explode the electric transformers, which gave the city light, and have the boys destroy the network of pipes underground, the essential water utilities in the sewers. So we came, the girl Chaya and me, and we had some bombs, magnetic bombs, and we connected them to the transformers. And that night, 4 transformers were exploded. With Germans walking through the streets, we hid in the shadows. We set the timers for 4 hours. We knew we had to flee Vilna, but the boys would not come. They were too tired. And sadly, we made it, and the boys did not, because they were tired. And we were tired too, but the women were stronger than the men.
Thank you. I'm just going to pull back up my PowerPoint. Sorry. So I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to work with such talented students and a whole team. And I'll talk a little bit more about the goals of the videos and the work with the students in the Q&A. I want to first focus on introducing you to the women. And one of the things that I found surprising in this research is how much testimony there is about these women heroines. And in the most public places at the Eichmann trial, Ava Kovner, one of the most famous of all Jewish resistance fighters, spoke at length both about Wittke Kempner and other women resistors. Of Wittke, he asked, "In this courtroom, there sits a woman who spent a certain time outside the ghettos with Aryan papers, living as a teacher of Catholic children in a secure place, and she and others like her were asked whether they were prepared to return to the ghetto." And he goes on and explains how crossing the ghetto, even with potatoes, was someone could be shot to death, but on her person, she transferred explosives and dynamites. And then he continues to memorialize the FBO chief liaison, Liza Magun, who was killed in February 1943, whose name became the rallying cry of the partisans in Vilna. Liza is calling. And her name, that meant so much during the Holocaust, should not be forgotten by us today. And yet, in analyses of the Eichmann trial, the role of women is hardly mentioned. We now turn our attention to Zivia Lubetkin, whose name in Polish became the code word for the country of Poland itself in the entire underground. She was the only woman on the high command of the Jewish fighting organization known as the ZOB, which held out against the German army for 4 weeks in April of 1943. Zivia Lubetkin was not yet 25 years old when World War II began, yet she already demonstrated strategic thinking about ideology and institutions. She had experience in the Zionist youth group Freiheit and then took a position training other youth leaders in Hahalutz HaTzair. This position required her to travel throughout Poland. She developed leadership skills that included strategic planning, creating community, critical reflection, self-restraint, and sustaining a common purpose. Even before the Nazis occupied Poland, she was a key part of Jewish mutual aid networks. And on Yom Kippur of 1940, their meeting was interrupted by Frumka Platnicka, one of the female couriers, announcing the plans to close the Warsaw Ghetto on November of 1940. Zivia immediately launched into negotiations with Polish employers to obtain seasonal agricultural work for Jewish youth on training farms, offering them invaluable moments of fresh air and food outside of the ghetto. Additionally, she made difficult decisions about searching for escape routes to Slovakia, Italy, and particularly to Eretz Yisrael. Her third priority was organizing social, educational, and cultural activities. Almost 100,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto died of hunger and disease. The need was great, and Zivia played a key role among those responding with emergency social welfare and assistance as part of DROR. Her strong diplomatic skills made her invaluable in negotiations with the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, the Judenrat, and the Bund. When the news of Ponary and Chelmno reached Warsaw in January of 1942, by way of the couriers or shariot, Zivia and others responded alongside her husband Yitzhak Zuckerman. They nurtured the formation of the first anti-fascist organization in Warsaw in April of 1942, around the time of Passover. Resistance began to gather momentum. Within a few months, priorities had shifted to acquiring arms. 2 weeks after the start of the Great Deportation in the summer of 1942, when Yanis Korczak, along with, let us not forget, Stefania Wilninskaya, who ran the orphanage as a team with Korczak, marched with their 200 orphans to the trains. And when Rachel Roth's 3 younger siblings were deported to Treblinka death camp as well, Zivia was one of the founders of the Jewish Fighting Organization, which brought together representatives of Hashomer Hatzair, Dror HaHalutz, and Akiba youth movements. Printed wall posters and manifestos encouraged hiding, and they sent people to the Aryan sector to obtain weapons. Frumka, who had been called Die Mama, began to call herself the grave digger of the Jews for all of her warnings for the Jews to go into hiding. 6 months later, when the Germans entered the ghetto, they were ready. Her tactical choices and reflections are evident in her memoir and captured in this video, which represents her writing about the January Action, 3 months before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, when another 6,000 Jews were deported to her death and the ZOB fought the Germans for the first time. The video shows the Nazi reaction to women fighting, although none of the women made up any of the 27 section leaders. They were numerous in the ZOB. Finally, this video describes her escape through the sewers. She was only one of 34 ZOB fighters to survive the war, which weighed heavily on her. Listen carefully to her reflections as she makes her way out of the burning ghetto.
There was a community of people who cared about each other, that shared ideas and values in common, made it possible for each of us to do what he or she did. This was the source of our strength. Why is it that we only learn the names of the perpetrators, Eichmann, Himmler, Goebbels, but not those who resisted? Say her name, Zivia Lubetkin. Zivia Lubetkin.
The Germans could no longer just pick Jews off the street. They were now forced to enter every building and search for their victims. Therefore, we decided we would not attack them in the open, but would wait for them to come to us. We assumed they would not take too many precautions, since they were not expecting us to be waiting for them with guns in our hands. We hid in our positions. We were about 40 men and women under Yitzhak Zuckerman's command. We had only 4 hand grenades and 4 pistols in our possession. Most of us were armed with iron pipes, sticks, and our own original weapon. Light bulbs filled with sulfuric acid. Just let the Germans come, and we will burn their disgusting faces with this cocktail of ours. We know that after we inflict casualties, we will be overpowered by their forces and destroyed. But we wait eagerly for them to arrive. The hour of revenge has come. We will fall with honor and dignity. The house fell silent. The few Jews living abandoned their apartments in search of safer hiding places. The hush was periodically disturbed by the agonizing cries of the Jews being led to the Umschlagplatz. The wailing was punctured by German screeching, "Laufen, schnell, schneller laufen, run, faster, run." Our mood was unsteady. At times, the tension led up to be replaced by an all-encompassing sadness. We stood apart, each of us alone with his thoughts clutching his gun. This was how we awaited the first shot. The systematic extermination in Warsaw had been going on for half a year, and not a single shot had been fired at the murderers. What would happen now? Would we stand the test? In the end, with heavy and tortured hearts, we all descended into the sewer canal. I now felt the full meaning of the plunge. Your legs are drenched in the foul-smelling cold slime of the sewer, but you keep on walking. You crawl through the sewer canal, utterly exhausted, but your mind never ceases to function, never rests. Your entire being is centered on the reckoning of your life, and the movement which has given that life meaning and purpose. You envision the shadow of a distant dream you shared with your comrades, a dream of a far-off land, of Eretz Yisrael, and its life of friendship and work, human dignity and pride.
I focus on the January uprising because of the tactics that Zivia uses, and it shows how valuable was her leadership in this unit of youth of Dror and Gordonia, led by Zivia Lubetkin and Zakaria Artstein, who laid an ambush for the Germans inside the building. Mordechai Anilevich's men had confronted the Germans with hand grenades on the Umschlagplatz in a different tactic than the one that would be adopted in the April uprising. Zivia devotes a full chapter to the female couriers who worked tirelessly with her. I'm going to, in the interest of time, we'll come back to this in the Q&A. Zivia was directly involved in military operations in both the January and April uprisings. For example, Mordechai Anielewicz often needed Lubetkin's help to ease tensions with ardent Dror activists in his area. At the height of the battle in late April, the Komida, notably including Zivia, directed the battle in the central ghetto. In the May 8th escape from the sewer, Zivia not only carried her gun, but threatened to use it over a disagreement regarding her decision about rescuing fighters. Further, 22% of the fighters in the Warsaw uprising, including Zivia, were women. Her colleague Shalom praised her in these terms: Zivia's leadership skills were tremendous. No, quote, "The emotional ability to unite such a group in such a short time was one of the wonders of those days, and it was thanks mainly to Zivia's talents and her ability to unite a group of youngsters with an ideological experience full of warmth, comradeship, and brotherhood to serve as a shelter for times of attack and disaster." And now it is my honor to introduce Rachel Roth and the story of as an eyewitness of the uprising, along with her son Ram and granddaughters. In the spring of 2014, I met Rachel Roth, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and of the death camps of Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, shortly before I took my students to those sites. Rachel's memoir, Here There Is No Why, highlights her exchange in Majdanek and the promise to a woman who was not Jewish, who hears her speak about the Shabbat, to bear witness. In the early days of the Warsaw Ghetto, Rachel was 14 years old. She studied literature and chemistry in illegal schools while working first at home, sewing buttons, and later in many different jobs inside and out of the ghetto. She gradually became aware of the underground movement through leaflets and friends who are committed to resistance. Rachel's loss of her younger siblings in the Great Deportation and of her mother transformed her. Javi Dreyfus's most recent book on the final year of the Warsaw Ghetto argues that 98% of the Jews who did not take up arms but hid, as Rachel and her grandfather did, help account for what enabled the ZOB and other armed forces to hold out for 4 weeks against the Germans, and therefore must be considered resistors. But in every way, you will see resistance throughout Rachel's story. Here is her tragic history presented with her speaking as well as dramatization in our final video this evening.
Finding work has become increasingly difficult in a densely populated ghetto. For young people and us children, there is only one way to keep occupied, and that is to study. My mother has decided we will continue our education no matter what. Hitler may rob us of all our possessions, but he can never take away what you have learned, she says with conviction. Time does not stand still, even in a war. Someday this nightmare will end. There's a Polish proverb. If little Jan does not study, then Jan will be ignorant. We must not give our enemies that satisfaction. We will not give in to that diabolical scum.
So I told him, I told him I want to help also. He said, no, you are a girl, you don't know, you will not, they will catch you, they will kill you. And I put the gun in my, I had high shoes. And then somebody gave me 2 packages. They told me to put this in the coat on my back, on here, and the dress and in the coat. And then after the work was finished, I came to the gate. The German checked me, and he found the butter and bread, and he smacked me, but he didn't find the gun. And the following day we were sitting, we already went, it was Erev Pesach. We went we jumped through the ceiling down to the, and my grandfather threw a package of matzah because it was before Pesach, maybe we would not go out from there. And we were sitting and we heard a tank coming and shooting and crying and wounded people, and this thing became. When I was in my Danek, again was hanged because she tried to run away. A Jewish girl, a 16-year-old girl.
The Nazis wrote the girl who tried to run away on the scaffold to hang her. And we had to stand there, holding our eyes open to watch the hanging girl, because if somebody had in mind to do the same as what she did, this is what would happen to you.
We were standing all the night, and her body was hanging, and we were crying and praying and praying. And it was so cold, and all of a sudden somebody mentioned this Friday evening. For us, Friday evening, for us Jews, is a holiday. So I said, you know, I'm spreading out a white tablecloth on the firmament, you know. Do you see?
Do you see? This is my father's house on a Friday evening before the war. And do you see the bottle of wine? This is the bottle of wine. My mother is sitting next to the table in this beautiful dress, this beautiful Shabbos dress. And do you smell the challah from the kitchen smelling so nice? And, you know, they were listening to my story.
And then all of a sudden it is already dawn. Morning, 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and it was whistling. We can go on the block. And I go out, and then go again, a woman. And she's a child. She holds my hand, and she said, you have a gift for God. You can speak so nice. You can. Thank you very much for inviting me to the Shabbos table. But you must survive. God give you a gift, a wonderful gift of telling. You must to tell the word what they said. You promise me, promise me.
Ron, that was such a beautiful depiction of your mom's story. Can you tell us a little bit about, do you picture your mom as courageous? Or maybe one of the girls would like to answer?
I picture my mom as tough, courageous. I don't think about that, but I picture her as strong and tough and stronger than many people that we encounter in our daily life. And it's hard to imagine her dealing with all the things that she told us about, but I can see it. I definitely can see it.
I see someone in the chat asking if there's really 52 grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and maybe you also mention about going to Auschwitz for the 75th anniversary.
Go ahead.
So there are actually more ancestors than that. So she has 5 kids, 18 grandkids, and about 42, 43 great-grandchildren. So in total, it's over 60 descendants from her.
And she's very proud of that. And that's important to our family. That's important to her. Last year, just before the pandemic started, we were invited to the 75th anniversary. She was invited to the 75th anniversary of the Auschwitz liberation. And she was allowed to bring one person with her, but she instead brought the entire family. So we had over 40 people came with us. We were the largest delegation there, and it was pretty amazing.
It's beautiful. And she spoke, I guess, a few times at the girls' school. Can you tell us about that? And if maybe there was a special moment among the times that she spoke or went with you on trips to Auschwitz?
So I would say I was always really excited for her to come and talk to my classmates, because we had always learned about the Holocaust from a really young age, but really showing my friends that like I had lived with somebody who went through that and that it's really true and it's really real. It was really special, and it comes through like when she says, don't tell people about the Holocaust, but really tell people that I existed, I'm real, and you saw me and you knew me and I was real.
So she went, whenever she had a chance, she spoke. It started before she even wrote her book. She was telling the story. Every dinner table, every Shabbat table, every holiday table, you couldn't stop her from telling about what happened to her. And it was all very disconnected until she wrote her book, Here There Is No Why. And then it was sort of very clear to all of us the whole sequence of events, the who was in the story and who was her family, all the members that were killed. And my mother spoke at every opportunity she got, whether it was impromptu in front of a group of tourists at people traveling through Majdanek or Warsaw, or organized. She spoke at the State Department. She spoke at Raphael in Israel. She went with my children's school. 3 of them went on trips. Three children went on trips, or 2 children went on trips, and she went with 3 groups, even when she didn't have a grandchild on the trip.
Thank you, Ram and Clementine. And it's so beautiful to see all of you. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. Maybe there'll be more questions for the family, or maybe there's some questions for me.
Well, there's so much that we could talk about, and there's so many avenues to explore here. And hearing Rachel's story is really just so incredible, and also raises questions about how we tell our stories. And of course, for every person, that's going to be different, and it could be very, very different. Some people are reluctant to speak about their stories. Some are very open about their stories. And you've been teaching young people about the Holocaust. You've been helping them engage with primary sources in very interesting ways. So I have some questions about that. But I would actually like to go back to some of the women that you covered in the slides and just ask a very simple question. When we talk about the different roles that women had, it often comes up that they were couriers. Can you explain what that was? And if that was gendered, were there more women who were acting as couriers? What did that mean?
So yes, there were often women who were couriers, because often women had gone to Polish school and they were able to pass more easily linguistically. There also were gendered expectations that women might not be involved in resistance that could sometimes help them. I had skipped over a part that I wanted to read from Zivia's memoir that explains the story of how she writes about them in her memoir. There's a chapter, Our Women Liaisons. She writes about Lanka, who spoke not only Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew, but had studied French and German at the university and picked up English, Russian, and Ukrainian, who worked very closely with her and Yitzhak. And she wrote, "There is no destination Lanka could not reach." This is Zivia writing. "I remember packing her suitcase, hiding the dangerous material in a false compartment, thinking to myself anxiously, who knows what may happen to her? Indeed, on one trip, the Germans searched everyone's suitcase at a train station. Lanka didn't panic. At the last moment, she handed her heavy suitcase to a newly found German acquaintance who was so taken by her that he gallantly accompanied her to the train, past a line of German guards without the slightest suspicion of what he was carrying." So in that chapter of her memoir, she tells many stories.
Lori, what's the name of the memoir?
Zivia Lubetkin's memoir, In the Days of Destruction and Revolt. And you can also read about her a little more easily. It's easier to find her testimony in the Eichmann trial, where she also gives a lot of details, although less about the couriers. What really strikes me about her memoir is, unlike most autobiographies, she's really writing the history of a movement. It's about teamwork. And there's a glossary with about 200 names. I think half of them are women. And there's just an interest in painting everybody's picture that really makes it, it's part of what makes her so exceptional, that she really believed in the project as a collective project. And so she doesn't just inspire me in terms of her Holocaust, resistance is exceptional. It surprises me that more people don't know her name. I really believe it's essential that we should all know her name, the leaders of the ZOB and all she accomplishes. But Yitzhak Zuckerman on the 25th anniversary said, "The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, it's not for learning military tactics, although I think there are some in there, but it's about learning the school of the human spirit." And I really think that this approach of research and education as part, as as Holocaust education and in general leadership as a team is an amazing lesson we can learn with her. And that's why I tried to show that also in the videos, how I have to thank Maria Russolo, who edits all the videos with me, who directs them, who does the research, and the students. Ruth is the first human rights major, Holocaust and human rights minor at Wagner College. There's just a team of people who have volunteered their time and energy to back up this project. My colleague Laura Morwitz, who's co-organizing the Heroines of the Holocaust Conference this June, and then an extended one in June of 2022. So I hope there's many lessons that people will take from today, both about revisiting how we tell about the final solution. I studied with Saul Friedlander, one of the best Holocaust historians in the world, and I believe deeply that our questions have to ultimately answer, how did the Holocaust happen? And I believe writing that without telling the story of these women is an incomplete story. I believe their stories actually reveal a great deal about how the Jewish community responded to the final solution and specific strategic tactics these thousands of Jewish women displayed.
So, you know, what's so interesting is not only are we talking about these women's stories, which have not been brought to light and were often kind of marginalized, but they were young women, and there's so much there to unpack. And I have so many questions about that. First of all, questions about how your students today, when they're learning these histories and they realize how young these people were, both the men and the women who were resisting, how does that change their perception of history, number one? Number two, you know, I have a question about the role of these youth organizations like Dror and other youth organizations. How did they prepare their female members? Were they attentive to developing women within the cadre of the youth organizations, for example? Because it seems like the women who came out of those youth movements really were ready to take leadership positions. And of course, I also want to talk to you a little bit more about how the students responded to your use of drama and music as a pedagogical tool. But that's a lot of questions right there. Which one do you want to start?
Ram wants to say something.
Oh, please.
You asked a lot of interesting questions. The one I'd like to focus on is, they were only the young girls who could manage to survive, manage to fight. You know, my mother was 13 at the start of the war. And in terms of the youth connecting to make the, you know, the movement, you know, from what I heard about my mother's story is that she was willing to be 100% in. She smuggled guns twice into the ghetto, but on the third occasion, her grandfather, who was an old man of 50, caught her and stole her boots so that she could not do it again. So I don't know if the youth organizations treated the girls differently, but certainly the parents and the older generations treated the girls differently.
Interesting.
I want to start actually by going back to Rachel's story and reading Rachel's memoir, Here There Is No Why. I took 18 students and a couple of parents to Warsaw, Krakow, and Berlin, Warsaw, Krakow, and Auschwitz. And as students wrote the most beautiful reflections of how in Warsaw they felt they were walking in Rachel's footsteps. There's just this incredible connection, and you know, the USC Shoah Foundation has kind of been on the front lines of using video testimony and reminding us how powerful it is to hear the words of the survivors. And so this project actually started in that way with videos, and then with meeting survivors, my students meeting the survivors and studying the USC Shoah videos that had been done on Staten Island. There were 40 back in the 1990s. And they connected with the survivors so deeply through their words. For example, one of my students, Jessica, who's not Jewish, said that she felt like she got to know the survivor, Margot Capel, better than her own parents, because she listened to the tape hundreds of times to hear how the survivors were breathing. It's a method of acting developed by my colleague Teresa McCarthy, based off of Anna Devere Smith's work. And then we have now applied that to these women who are in the resistance. The same idea that the students can just, step into history. And as powerful as it is to hear someone, who's lived their life in this way, it's also an opportunity for the students to see that this person was actually only 17, only 22. I think, Zivia is 25 at the beginning of the war and 29 or 30, by the time of the uprising. So I think that element is somewhat, understudied. Although the Ghetto Fighters House Museum also does use some interesting dramatizations of Zivia and Mary Berg's and other testimonies by young actors. So it's just an interesting way to reach a new generation of young people. And for example, Marianne Cohn rescues a 10-year-old girl who later gives testimony. And so I have a girl as young as 10 who's studying the testimony and memorizing it. And this is like another project, Heroine Voices. We hope to do 50 women. And the bigger scholarly project is to ask, is there a canon? Is there a key set of women leaders whose names like Oskar Schindler and Raoul Wallenberg that everybody should know? And that would be Jewish women, Jewish women and non-Jewish women. Who are these women who were really, at the forefront? And then through their stories to get a much bigger group of women whose leadership can really inspire all of us. It's really essential to integrate rescue and resistance into the history of the Holocaust, as well as women's voices.
There have been some questions about the conference that you're planning. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about the conference on this topic that you're planning right now. And also, do you plan on having your students participate, and in what way are you going to have them participate?
Yeah, those are all good questions. I was just going to take 1 second to pull up the slide.
Okay, great.
For the conference. I happen to be on that slide, and let me just see here. Does that work? Can you see the slides again? So the conference was originally scheduled in its entirety for this June. We postponed the main conference 2 days, a 2-day conference, 45 international scholars from 10 different countries, speaking about all aspects of heroines of the Holocaust. We postponed that till next year. I hope many people will come. And this year we're doing a 1-hour mini conference with 6 of the world's leading scholars on this topic, presenting their research. And again, it's very much in the spirit of resistance in the Holocaust to have a collective, group working on this together. It's in the spirit of these women who believe so much in a common purpose. And one of the elements at the conference in next June will be an exhibit of tapestries of 10 fierce female Holocaust heroes created by Linda Stein. And she includes Zivia and Vitka, but also Hannah Sanish, Anne Frank, Noor Khan, a Muslim woman who is in the SOE and doing reconnaissance and who is killed, tortured at Dachau, and several other women of different faiths. And I just want to mention, among groups that have been doing this for a long time, the Remember the Women Institute has done a lot of work on memorializing and the site in Yad Vashem to Rosa Rabata. So that's also an important person to know, that there was women's resistance at Auschwitz. And one of the Staten Island Holocaust survivors that I work with was an eyewitness to that uprising, and Shirley Gottesman, and she also wrote a memoir and has done a lot of work. We've captured her testimony in many interesting ways, including her remembering the singing of the Hatikva at the end of the revolt. And just to quickly mention a few other people, Marianne Cohn has a garden at Yad Vashem in her memory. I'm currently fascinated by Josephine Baker and Marie Madeleine Fourcade. Fourcade is a non-Jewish woman who was at the top of the largest resistance network in France, the Alliance, which the Germans gave the name Noah's Ark. And Josephine Baker was using invisible ink on her sheet music, working directly with the French military to smuggle in information. And then this woman in the lower right is Noor Khan. There's a new film about her, A Call to Spy. And then I really want to rethink the art of the children in Terezin is not only a beautiful humanistic creation, but the way in which their teacher, Friedel Dicker Brandeis, tortured by the Gestapo, not tortured, but interviewed, interrogated, humiliated by the Gestapo in 1934, very early on, her work with non-Jewish women in a communist cell, and how that informs her teaching of art and looking at these canvases as a statement of defiance. And here you can see that this young girl, who is among the 250,000 Jewish children killed in Auschwitz, she creates this painting that in the sky, she's turned the sky red like blood and put Jewish stars in the sky, and taking this bureaucratic paper from the machinery of death and turned it upside down. It's just astonishing, these works, when you start to revisit them from this lens of women and resistance. And to remember that Hannah Senesh was with 2 other women, that there were 3 women among the 27 parachutists from Palestine. You start looking into these stories, right? Anne Frank, you have to look at The Rescuer, Miep Gies, and this broad definition of resistance and how that can create empathy. And to go back to my students, how fascinating it is for non-Jewish students, or Jewish and non-Jewish students, they meet with children in yeshivas, and they teach the children in the yeshivas about these lessons of the Holocaust and show them these monologues. And it's just, it's just so beautiful to see students of all races, African-American students, Hispanic students, men and women, Jewish women playing Jewish men, and crossing all these boundaries. It opens up a new kind of empathy in relation to testimony.
Yeah. I want to put in a plug also for people who are interested in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's a really incredible new movie, new-ish, in the last 2 years, called Who Will Write Our History, which is about the Emanuel Ringelblum Oinig Shabbos collective in the Warsaw Ghetto. And Rachel Auerbach, who was part of that and survived and went on to become a very important leader of, she was collecting testimony for Yad Vashem when Yad Vashem started in Israel in the 50s. And she also has a really incredible story. So the movie is a dramatization of her and what happened in the ghetto. And I highly encourage people to watch it. It's now available for streaming. Who Will Write Our History? I'm going to put that in the chat.
Yeah, and I believe that the Museum of Jewish Heritage will circulate some, ideas about sources. There's a tremendous film put out by the museum in Warsaw that dramatizes the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and is somewhat, is more inclusive. It includes Zivia's story and I think also Tosia Altman among the key resistance fighters that they depict. So, I mean, again, and there's also a new book that's coming out, and I believe Judy Battalion is speaking at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Right. And her book is being reviewed and has been optioned for a film. So more and more of this work is coming along, and I encourage everybody to ask these kinds of questions. What does Holocaust education look like when you ask about both rescue and resistance, when you see it as a form of defiance from which we can learn today, and particularly when you can think about the women in these rescue and resistance movements and their defiance as inspiring leaders. I think it's a new way to look at the Holocaust, and I think it's very valuable.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I think it really comes organically out of hearing so many survivor stories. I've been, having lunch and spending time with my students and survivors for almost 10 years. And very often I'm listening and I'm thinking, there's so much courage in these stories. That is something we have to pay more attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, we also have to think about how even the smallest acts of resistance took enormous amounts of courage because the stakes were so high.
Yeah, and that's why we led with Rachel's mother's story, of Golda's attitude that she had to send her children to school in the ghetto, even though it was illegal. It was critical, and I believe that, there's another set of questions I just started to hint at of the motivation that these young women have for resisting. And I believe, in Rachel's case, her storytelling in Madonna can be traced back to her mother's defiance in Warsaw. And, there's a bigger story with Rachel's family, but that's for, another program about her father, who was a journalist, a Yiddish journalist, and so on.
There were a lot of questions about Rachel's story, and I'm so thankful we were able to have the Roth family here. And I hope that we'll have some more resources about her and her story so that people can follow up when there's going to be resources sent out tomorrow, correct? Because I know there's just a lot of interest there and way too more questions than we can get to now, unfortunately.
I just want to say, Lori, you suggested that I think about, was Golda a heroine? And I honestly never thought about it until you just sent it out just before this meeting. And absolutely, because one thing is you're focusing on telling the children to learn. She had the opportunity to run away with her husband, who was being hunted by the Gestapo. And she said, no, you're going to be more successful if you go alone. You're going to be easier to hide, easier to transport. She stayed behind and stayed with the children and stayed with her family and sacrificed herself for him. And then later on, when she actually had papers to leave Warsaw, she had Palestine papers that he arranged for her. She said, I'm not leaving without my children. She stayed behind because some of her children were already taken, and she was determined to find them. So she certainly was a source of strength for my mother. I think even throughout her life, my mother talks to her about, my mother will mention to us how her mother gave her good advice and how, I just lost you, sorry. So how her mother gave her strong advice and made her who she was, even though she was just a child at the time. She also survived with her aunt Ella, who was another very strong figure, who sacrificed her food so that my mother can survive, and they kept each other alive. So thank you for having us, and thank you for shining the spotlight, Lori, on the heroines of the Holocaust.
It's always wonderful to see your mom and to be able to share her story. Writing the play, including the survivors of Staten Island stories and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, was very powerful. It's really, thousands of students have seen it now on Staten Island and in New Jersey and in Manhattan. And we hope to continue to do that.
Okay. Lori, do we have anything else to cover? We've covered a lot here.
Yes. Well, just to reiterate, it's not just a topic for Women's History Month, but I do urge everybody to listen to the full speech that Sarah Geneitzer Rubinson gave on International Women's Day 1944. You can find it on the heroinevoices.org website. And we'll have all those links in the email that's sent around. And just to mention that all three of these women fit a theory by Avihu Ronen of dual leadership. All of them had partners that were also in the resistance. And that's the whole power couple is a whole nother another topic. But in terms of women, I just want everybody to just remember these numbers: 12,000 Jewish, non-Jewish women, righteous Gentiles, 3,000 Jewish women. There are so many stories, and please keep looking for them and sharing them. I think it's really essential. And I hope that you will also join us in this work.
Thank you, Lori, for presenting such an incredible program of information that is just given us so many questions, and there's so many places that I know a lot of people are going to be looking for more information and are going to be following up and also following your work in the future. So I think that I'm going to say thank you for putting together this evening, and we're going to go to Ari Goldstein from the Museum of Jewish Heritage to wrap up the evening.
Hi. A very big thank you on behalf of the museum for sharing your scholarship with us, Lori, for moderating this for us, Rachel, and to Rachel and your family for being with us. It's so eye-opening and heartwarming to have you with us. And it's a reminder of how recent this history was. So we were left with a lot to think about. We will send out that email tomorrow with a recording, a link to Rachel's book, and many other follow-up resources. We hope you guys will join us with Judy Battalion next month and with all the other programs we host at the museum. And I do want to mention that everything we do at the Museum of Jewish Heritage is made possible by the support of community members like you watching tonight. So if you're able, please consider making a donation in support of the museum. And if you've already donated, you're a member of the museum, thank you so much for making our work possible. So I'm going to wish everyone a great evening. Rachel, Lori, Rachel, thank you. And